going to go a little faster than I normally prefer to go. I'd like to have more discussions, and we will start the class by having a discussion, but I'm going to shorten those discussions a little bit just so that we can get through and stay with the schedule. So I wanted to start out by having a conversation about what is culture. So what are some of the things when we think about culture? What is it?
Ceremonies and holidays we have.
Absolutely.
Norms and customs.
Values.
Religion.
Yeah.
Art.
Absolutely.
Food.
Sorry, my handwriting gets way messier the lower down the board.
Language.
Yeah.
Pretty much the same as norm. Taboos.
Absolutely. So both what is normal, what is appropriate behavior, but also what is taboo behavior. And there are some universal taboos. There's kind of a universal incest taboo, and that's probably linked to a lot of things, but essentially survival. But what is taboo in one culture may not be taboo in another.
Would education fit into this?
It could, certainly. And furthermore, what do we educate on? What kind of education is valued? And so this kind of education being one sort of education, but there's many different ways to educate.
Could politics be one?
Certainly, and one of the things that's interesting is we start getting into, you guys will learn how bad a speller I am. One of the interesting things is we start to get into things like education and politics. We start to see that not only is this very much influenced by culture, but then it goes on to influence culture, and so it becomes pretty circular. So where do we learn about culture? How do we gain culture? How do we become a culture reader? Certainly. Probably our first teachers. Yeah.
Proximity, or how close you want to sit with you.
Absolutely.
Your peers.
Yes, definitely. Especially in adolescence. Most of our peers become far more important in acculturating us than our parents are.
So would it be like social media or anything you need?
Absolutely. Education. We learn our culture through the educational system. The fact that you all are sitting out there and looking at me as if I'm doing something or have something to give you implies a certain valuing of the way that we understand education. The fact that it took you guys a few seconds and you're all hesitant to answer my first question about where culture comes from speaks to this notion that I should be answering your questions, not that you should be answering mine. It's an ideology we have in our own culture about education, and that I have something that I can give you, that I can put into your brains, as opposed to something that we collectively develop together. So what does culture influence? Politics, education, Say more about that.
Well, you know, like there's, I think it's in Thailand where they wear the automatic like rings around their neck, so that's part of their culture, I would say.
So our perceptions of beauty,
Okay.
what we believe to be attractive. What else?
Tolerance.
Say more about that.
Well, how do I put it? Part of multicultural diversity is like learning about other cultures and tolerating that. Yeah, there are some things that we don't agree on, but I'm not gonna like bash for it. So tolerance.
Okay, so being willing to engage in accepting that just because I believe something that doesn't necessarily mean
Yeah.
that you believe it and that we can be okay disagreeing.
Politics.
Say more about that.
Like, this is just an example. When I was growing up, my mom told me that I can't date Mormons because
Mhm.
if I end up getting married, she wouldn't be able to attend my wedding.
Okay. So who we enter into relationships with and how we engage in those relationships. Yeah.
Kind of on that sexuality, I feel like if our culture is like a heterosexual culture, then that's what you're gonna be first gonna try to figure something into.
Absolutely. So it kind of goes back to values and taboos. And in a heterosexual culture, which I would argue we are, although becoming increasingly accepting, people tend to attempt to fit themselves into the heteronormative boxes that they're supposed to as a result of what is historically is to some extent still taboo. Yeah.
Communication, like how to communicate with each other.
Absolutely, and what we perceive about that communication. So how we speak to people, but also how we perceive things like tone of voice and proximity, which we will talk about probably in 2 weeks. My guess is it's week 3, but I'm not positive. So, the history of the multicultural movement is important, partly because I'm kind of a history nerd, so forgive me. But also, I think it's important to understand how we came to be having conversations about multiculturalism, and why we're having these conversations now and in such an important way. So the reality is that science during the Age of Enlightenment spent a lot of time attempting to prove that minority members of society, and when we're talking here, we're talking about women, we're talking about queer people, we're talking about people of color. Science was actively invested in proving that those people were inferior. We use things like phrenology, where we look at and feel the bumps on people's heads to determine their personality structures. We used physiognomy, which is the study of the skeletal body, to, again, essentially to prove the inferiority of colonized people. We also use IQ testing, and we'll talk later in the week about IQ testing and some of the challenges we face with regard to IQ testing. But the reality is that all of these mechanisms were biased, in part because the people who were conducting this science were biased in so they wanted to prove, they set out to prove the inferiority of groups of people, and then chose to, their findings then resulted in that, yeah.
So basically, it was scientific racism.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
In many ways, this scientific racism led to the eugenics movement, and the most famous practitioners of the eugenics movement, and specifically the negative eugenics movement, were the Nazi Party. However, positive eugenics, which is breeding for positive characteristics, actually began in the United States. So intelligent people and wealthy people should breed. You should intermarry and have children with other wealthy people, because that will pass on better genes. This is all grounded in the model, the deficit model. So a model that essentially justifies oppression and segregation. And so this essentially non-white, non-male, non-hetero people were viewed as somehow deficient, and culturally deficient specifically. Then we have ethnic minority psychologists. Starting in the 1940s, the Clarks were two of the first ethnic minority psychologists. And they did a number of studies, but they started to look at how this deficit model was impacting people. And so we're going to watch a short video on that. There is some offensive language in this video. And story of my life, there's no sound in this video. Okay, this could be loud.
Hello, Vernon. Sit down. Show me a white doll. Now show me a colored doll. Show me the doll that you like best. And which doll is most like you?
That one.
All right, Anne. Show me a white doll. Show me a colored doll. Show me the doll that has a nice color. Show me the doll that looks ugly. Show me a white doll. Show me a Negro doll. Which doll is an ugly doll?
That one. That's the nigger.
No?
So that's a dramatic representation of the work that the Clarks were actually doing. Obviously, that's not historically perfect. One of the things I'd like to highlight here is that even as late as the late 1990s, they were doing studies like this and finding similar things. That black children were much more likely to value the white doll, identify the white doll as pretty, as opposed to the one that looked like that. Things are a little better now, but still imperfect. So as we think about moving into the civil rights movement, because I think if we're really talking honestly about why we're having a class on multiculturalism and social justice now, it's because of the civil rights movement. And so a number of things happened. Those inferiority and deficit myths really had a fairly major impact on individuals, as we saw in that video that we just watched. We also had segregation, oppression, murder or lynching, depending. We had the eugenics movement. We had a level of inequality. Then we saw a number of soldiers in World War II and Korea and Vietnam fighting and dying, but still not living in a country where they had equal access. And so all of these things came together to create the civil rights movement. The first legislation around civil rights and equal access was in the late 1940s. The most famous and probably the most familiar of these legislative acts was the Brown versus Board of Education that happened in 1956. But there was a number of things that led up to this. And so it was a result of all of these things that we started having conversations around culture and identity and race and ethnicity. So when we think about culture and we try to define culture, the reality is that it becomes really difficult really quickly, because what happens in a culture influences that culture, which then goes on to influence what happens in that culture. As we talked about, it becomes really circular really quickly. And so we can talk about both broad and narrow definitions of culture. Broad definitions being any potentially salient status or identity, and the narrower being subcultural groups. So you guys are simultaneously students, which is super broad, but you're also wildcats. Students specifically at Central Washington University. Most of you are also psychology students. So we can start with the really broad, and when we talk about students as a whole, we're talking about students who are being educated at Juilliard in New York City. When we're talking about wildcats, we're talking about 12,000 people that are students on this campus. When we're talking about psychology students, we're talking about approximately 900 students who are majoring in psychology. And so we can get narrower and narrower. How do these broad and narrow different definitions function? How do they help us understand?
Well, we might all be Americans or be American culture, but rural America, urban America, college students versus older generations, they all interact with the world differently.
Absolutely. So we have different experiences of the world, and we interact with the world differently. So the fact that I'm a professor means that I interact with the world in a particular way. But the fact that I'm a female professor also has an impact. And so as we start to pull apart the narrower cultural subgroups, we start to understand nuance more effectively. Because the reality is that even as wildcats, admittedly, I don't remember ever being terribly excited about my alma maters. We were the lumberjacks, and I didn't really care. But there are probably students in this room who get really excited for football games. There are also probably students who have never been to a football game and never plan to. We want to be able to understand the nuanced differences between those groups. But if we just call each other, or if we just call everybody wildcats, then it implies something, right? Or I could call you CWU students. That implies something completely different. It's actually the same category, but it implies something completely different, because when I say CWU students, I'm not focusing on the mascot, and thus not focusing on the sports, and thus not focusing on that particular aspect of your identity. The reality is, however, that although we have many salient aspects of our identity, that those overlap. I was just mentioning that I'm a female and a professor. I'm also in my mid-30s. All of those those things have an impact on how I perceive the world, how the world interacts with me. It's not just one of those things that impacts my experience of the world, but all of those things. I'm white. The language I speak, whether I speak with an accent or not, whether I speak standard English or non-standard English, all of those things are going to impact both how I see myself and how the world sees me. And so this idea of intersectionality, I think, is really important because it allows us to understand how people who fit in those broad categories similarly may have very different experiences of the world because of other aspects of their identity. I think the other thing that's important to keep in mind about intersectionality is that it's fluid. So each of you is a particular age right now. But within the next 365 days, you will be a different age. Regardless of when your birthday is, you will be a year older. And we continue to do that until we die. But that means that to some extent, we will be perceived differently. For those of you who are not yet 21, your 21st birthday is oftentimes a really big deal. Somehow that marks a new level of adulthood because you have access to something that you didn't legally have access to before. I'm not ridiculous, I know. People drink before they turn 21. So I think it's important just to keep in mind that our multiple identities all have an impact on our experience of the world. So, you guys know that you are going to do reflections. Your reflection for this part of this week, your first chapter, is on this. I want you to take a stance about whether race is a biological construct or a sociocultural construct. Or maybe it's both. And then I want you to answer the second part of this question. What impact does your answer have on the lived experiences of you and other members of society? So take about 10 minutes.